The Logical Fallacy Detection Kit by John Thomas Kooz. Why I concisely wrote this. I wrote this because I wanted there to be and wanted to read a well-written, comprehensible, but succinct and accessible guide for understanding logical fallacies. Concision is important because often tomes become tombs. I like that little parable I just created. A tome, or a really long text, often becomes a tomb for good knowledge, because if something is so lengthy, the good knowledge in it is rarely accessed. Most people won't get through a tome, something incredibly lengthy. Therefore, I made this piece brief, roughly 60 pages, because I wanted this guide to be concise enough to be used as a quick reference, but also sufficiently explanatory to provide adequate comprehension and examples of logical fallacies. There are many books out there on logical fallacies. Some go into more detail than others. This parsimonious but complete short reference book should be looked at as an accessible guide to prominent logical fallacies. There are more logical fallacies that exist than those presented in this book, but I have chosen ones that seem to have the most usage. In other words, you will encounter the logical fallacies in this book more than the obscure fallacies. Thus, the content presented in this book will be more useful than a book that fails to concentrate on prominent and common logical fallacies. People exhibit diseased, tarnished, confused, lost, incorrect, warped, and infected thinking all the time. The cause of a denigrated cognitive process is often logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are the leaks or cracks through which fallacious mind viri seep into the mind. If you trace the root of any deranged, delusional, or illogical belief, any superstition, or any value of something non-existent, any incorrect or erroneous belief, back to its origin, you will almost always see that it was through the flaw of some logical fallacy that the marred thinking weaseled its way into the pristine laboratory of one's mind. If advertisements, groups, people, and individual trains of thought eliminated logical fallacies, our world would be, ironically, unthinkably different. Almost everyone has some thought or belief supported by logical fallacy. You may have many superstitions lurking or worse, controlling certain elements of your day. I think it's important for us to have an acquaintance with logical fallacies, just like it is wise and prudent for one to be familiar with local diseases or viruses in order to appropriately prevent infection. Thus, this quick reference can be thought of as a cognitive immunization, a cognitive medical reference or vaccine for the mind that thwarts diseased thinking. This book could be useful for a scholar or a lawyer or a logician, but it really is designed for anyone who wants to cleanse their mind of illogical traps to think, live, work, and enjoy more clearly. This book will add resilience, agility, and strength to one's thinking. As a result, this book upgrades your mind. Good times. Enough introduction with the logical fallacy detection. Introduction. Picture a logical world. Really, actually do picture a logical world. Why is it important to learn logic and logical fallacies? Logical fallacies are traps. They're cognitive snares that often closely resemble valid arguments. However, despite their frequent resemblance to truth and valid inferences, logical arguments, despite how much you want something to be true, are just as false as 1 plus 4 equals 75. There's no point in pretending or blurring the way something is phrased in regards to 1 plus 4 equals 75. That will always be false. It's good that some things are false and some things are true, because that shows humans are capable of proving and disproving, that Karl Popper's falsifiability conjecture is significant, and that the scientific method is indeed very useful. Because of the dangerous resemblance to the truth, logical fallacies can keep one stuck, transfixed, or erroneously locked in a geographical, mental, financial, or emotional place that doesn't make sense. Logical fallacies can cause one to do things that are harmful. Mere resemblance to truth is as far from truth as 1 plus 4 equals 75. Additionally, appearance can be distracting because some things that look false can be 100% true. However, appearance of truth does not equal truth. There are many things that defy common sense, appear ludicrously false, but astonishingly are true, and vice versa. The speed of light in Einstein's special relativity, as well as the incredibly tiny measurements in quantum mechanics, approach areas that defy common sense, but not truth. It is indeed proven and true that the length of objects undergo minuscule contractions at or approaching the speed of light in special relativity. Additionally, the location and speed of an electron particle cannot be simultaneously measured in quantum mechanics. Length, contraction, and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle thus defy common sense and appear false, but they are true. Therefore, making judgments on what is true or false based on appearances is itself a logical fallacy. Using appearance as a criterion for truth can be considered a metalogical fallacy because it is often the alluring resemblance to truth that makes people commit logical fallacies. Just a note, when I mentioned erroneously locked in a geographical, mental, financial, or emotional place that doesn't make much sense, that may have sounded a bit self-help bookish, but you may indeed help yourself by thinking more clearly as a result of this book. This book is not about inspiring you to be motivated and having a zippity-doo-dah day, although you may find learning about logical fallacies quite motivating. This book is about logic and heightening your detector for fallacies so you can avoid them. In a sense, this book increases your immunity to flawed and broken thinking so you are less susceptible or completely immune to thinking. Something is false when it is true, and something is true when it is false. In other words, your clarity will not be diluted with lies that appear true as a result of this book. Appearance of truth is not a criterion for truth. See special relativity in quantum mechanics. Only through honing your logical fallacy detection skills and using logical evaluation can you correctly assess truth from falsity. Can you imagine what it would be like if no one committed logical fallacies? The effects are truly incomprehensible. For example, if one thought, I would be cool by smoking a cigarette because I saw an ad of a famous celebrity smoking a cigarette, the advertising and tobacco industries would certainly take a hard slap across the face, and the success of those two industries, which do indeed rely quite heavily upon logical fallacies, would plummet and greatly deteriorate, if not become obsolete altogether. Additionally, the medical field would see much less lungs infected with emphysema, more money would stay in people's pockets and not cross a gas station counter for a suicidal inhalant, and people would think a whole lot more clearly as well. While I primarily only read math, computer science, and logic texts, I do have one exception, an exceptional Australian general science magazine called Cosmos. They reported on numerous studies of the mind control of advertising. I dislike mentioning the word mind control because it's a messy topic, too big of a topic, too many interpretations, and outside the scope of this book. But needless to say, the more logic you use, the less controlled you will ever be, and the more self-autonomy you will possess. Additionally, the blurry topic of mind control is inappropriate for this book because the Logical Fallacy Detection Kit is about hard lines of logic and logical fallacies. That said, a person who only uses logic is in a sense practically 100% immune to mind control or infectious advertising. This article from the above-mentioned journal pointed out that imitation was a major cause for infectious marketing. Advertising companies design advertisements with the assumption that observers will see someone higher up on the social ladder using a product and then commit the fallacy of, if someone more successful uses that, I might use that and become successful. We will see this form of blurred, vague, and irrational thinking later and detect it and ensure it doesn't infect you. If you see a successful person using a product, that means using that product will make you successful. This is not even a valid premise. That is an invalid premise, so we can't even make an inference from it. Here's what Cosmos says about imitation and the dangers of putting logic to the wayside. If we are going to imitate someone, it makes sense to imitate those who appear to be popular, successful, and desirable. Cigarette commercials, for example, have historically been inhabited with young, attractive, and successful people, as well as representatives of prestigious and trustworthy professions. In fact, until the 1950s, medical doctors often appeared in cigarette commercials. Who better than a doctor to assure that smoking is healthy? Imitation does work in the wild. A certain type of butterfly, the viceroy, Liminitis archipus, mimics or imitates a monarch butterfly, Danis plexippus, to appear more toxic to avoid predators. Biologically, both species of butterfly are unpalatable to predators, but only the monarch is actually toxic. Thus, the viceroy employed mimicry and imitation for survival reasons. But that's based on logic. Consuming cigarettes or purchasing and wearing certain clothing or eating junk food because an advertiser arranges for someone who appears successful to use that product is defying logic. Advertisers expect people to use logical fallacies. This is warped, disturbing, and morally wrong, but psychological studies that have gone into making advertisements more effective are often wrought with the exploitation and utilization of logical fallacies. Advertising would plummet without logical fallacies. If you detect and prevent yourself from logical fallacies, you will eliminate things that were purchased unreasonably and prevent unreasonable, useless things from infecting your life. In short, you'll be a whole lot healthier. Another consideration. Because there is a voluptuous woman sitting on that car in that advertisement, then I will be able to date that woman by buying that car. People make logical fallacies all the time in regards to deciding what to purchase. In that advertisement, the purchaser of that car would almost certainly never even meet the woman in the advertisement. For the sake of completeness, an audience shallow enough could judge a person as cool by smoking a cigarette, and a woman possessing an obscenely superficial and destructively manipulative personality could decide to date a person based on the thousands of dollars wasted on a four-wheeled rubbish vehicle, but those are just poor, warped, and saddeningly, and arguably maddeningly, impoverished preferences or outlooks, and nothing remotely related to logical conclusions. This book is about assisting you in making logical conclusions while avoiding illogical conclusions. The consequence of doing just that may very well increase your health, save you money, and prevent you from wasting your time with superficial audiences and obscenely superficial and emotionally destructive people. Instead, you will gravitate towards uplifting people, reasonable conclusions, and logical decisions. But the main goal is to eliminate the cognitive viri that are logical fallacies that infect one's thinking. Eradicating logical fallacies activates a very rewarding lucidity. The consequences of that lucidity, of that clear, logical fallacy-free thinking are, well, quite fun and enjoyable. The world would be a very different place if people didn't gullibly and illogically misconstrue what is false with what is true and vice versa. I've written a great deal on atheism, and I will not touch that topic here other than simply saying that religion would cease to exist if so did logical fallacies. To activate a valid argument form, which you will learn about shortly, called modus tollens, A. If logical fallacies no longer existed, religion wouldn't exist. B. No more logical fallacies are committed. C. Therefore, religion does not exist. Unfortunately, step B is not yet true. Logical fallacies do exist and are committed. I will not be so ambitious to think that this book, or any book for that matter, will cure human thought of all logical fallacies, but I certainly do trust that this book will make a profoundly good crack at eliminating logical fallacies, provide you with an awareness that will protect you from logical fallacies and things that may resemble truth, but that are not true. Ultimately instill a greater appreciation of the positive health benefits in mind and body of using logical arguments and conclusions. The main focus of this book, however, is providing you with a near immunity to logical fallacies so that you can detect them and not be duped, and so that you can eradicate illogical thinking from your own cognition. Appealing to emotion is not a good devotion. What is appealing to emotion? Basically, it's blurring an emotional experience or feeling with clear logical reasoning. I will list a couple forms of appealing to emotion, communicate why appealing to emotion is a destructive fallacy, and then comment on how emotions and logic are occasionally very important for decision making when used without fallacy. In other words, when constructively and intelligently. Also, using emotions and logic in decisions can be accomplished without fallacy. What is appealing to emotion? Appealing to emotion has the form enjoyable, appealing, auspicious, welcoming, good, or fortuitous emotions are connected with N, or with not N. Therefore, N is true, or not N is true. Some forms of appealing to emotion are appeal to fear, cudgel, appeal to pity, appeal to popularity, appeal to flattery, wishful thinking. Examples. I really wish there to be $20,000 in my bank account. Therefore, there is 20,000 pounds or dollars in my bank account. Wishful thinking fallacy. If you don't read this horribly written, perverse, and misleading religious scripture, you will go to hell. Appeal to cudgel, fear fallacy. That food is stale and has been sitting out for 3 days. Looks and tastes gross, but you better eat it because there are starving people in Somalia. Appeal to pity fallacy. I'll get into the details of the appeal to emotion fallacies, but basically it is the distortion of an emotion to get you to do something that you feel you should do. Granted, some things are good to do, and it's okay to view a situation differently in order to accomplish something if accomplishing said thing will have productive, professional, desirable, and/or auspicious results. But avoid victimization from appeal to emotion in any situation. Overall, appeal to emotion is where some emotion gets one to believe a lie or untruth. Emotions are great and marvelous as is imagining, as you will understand, but using emotion to dupe one into thinking something false is true when it is false is the umbrella category of appeal to emotion. Forms of appealing to emotion. Appeal to fear. Examples. If you don't read some random perverse religious scripture, you will go to hell. I fear the fact that 3 to the third power is 27, so 3 to the third power is 29. Obviously, appeal to fear is fallacious. Fearing something doesn't make it true. Appeal to fear is toxically used in religion all the time. Religion often says if you don't read whatever scripture, the fearful event of being punished after death will occur. That's pure appeal to fear and rubbish to every extent. There is no afterlife, I'm an atheist, and reading random religious scriptures will have zero effect on the non-existent afterlife, although doing so may likely cloud your thinking. Both those examples are obviously preposterous. Fearing the fact that something is mathematically true doesn't affect that mathematical truth. Just because one fears that 8 squared is 64 doesn't make it 49, which is 7 squared. Similarly, not reading some random sentences and sequences of letters and words in a religious scripture doesn't affect one's afterlife doom/punishment, because there is no afterlife. Religion itself is pure fallacies upon fallacies. Life is when one is alive. Here's another subtle appeal to fear example. Hi, Professor Green. I see you're grading papers there. I worked very hard on my paper. By the way, when you get to grading my paper, do remember that my sister, Madame Plum, is the headmaster of the school, the person who gives you your paycheck. That's practically a concealed threat, but it is a classic example of appeal to fear. Professor Green, unswayed by such duplicitous and fallacious tactics, should disregard that appeal to emotion and grade each paper objectively, or better yet, he probably should get a different career in a different location where students aren't wankers. Haha, moving on. Appeal to fear is very angering to witness because fear is a strong emotion, and therefore seeing someone blindly doing something, derailing and or deterring simply out of a non-existent fear is very disturbing. Immunize yourself to appeal to fear. Rationally consider solutions and outcomes. Imagine what you want and do your best to implement uplifting outcomes into reality. Appeal to popularity. X is 1. X is popular. 2. Therefore, X is true. Or, obviously, that's just silly and ridiculous. Appeal to popularity is related to groupthink and a bandwagon effect, where a lot of people do something just because others are. To comment on something perversely angering and putrid, and basically messed up in every dimension, cults that had mass suicides probably used some groupthink and appeal to popularity. Idiotically, these other people are killing themselves, so you should too. Appeal to popularity kills individuality and is very dangerous. Identify it and cleanse your mind of that destructive fallacy. Conclusively, just because someone whom is well known does N, or just because someone approves of N doesn't make N true. Having a car is a waste of money, time, and is clutter. Just because lots of people have vehicles doesn't make them good things to have. Okay, that is a bit of an opinion, but still popularity does not equal validity. Some valid things are popular. A lot of people like eating salad, and salad is good for you, but many popular things can be invalid. Before Copernicus, many people held the popular view that the Earth was the center of the solar system, which is in fact false. The solar system is heliocentric with the sun in its center. The emotion of approval is what gets one to believe lies under the fallacy of appeal to popularity. I and or many people approve of N, 2, therefore N is true. Appeal to flattery. Too long didn't read. Flattery is the buttering up of sentences and using flowery compliments, washing the person in praise to make the subject more likely to acquiesce to a hidden idea that may be false. Appealing to flattery is flowering something N to try to make it seem more desirable or more true, but has zero bearing on the validity of N. Basically, if you hear someone say you're so amazing and blah, desirable, respectable quality, therefore you would or wouldn't do N, that's appealing to flattery and is, like most of all the logical fallacies, often angering, misleading, illogical rubbish. Technical form. The technical form of appeal to flattery is you have admirable, desirable, respectable, characteristic, or quality X. Therefore N. Or, obviously, that's total rubbish. While it seems obvious upon reading these logical fallacies that are fallacious, it is immensely helpful to identify them because if, when you encounter some of these fallacies, they do not seem obvious. Appeal to flattery is one of the more deadly and overlooked fallacies because it is often constrictedly intertwined with a compliment with getting someone to do something they normally wouldn't do. Appeal to flattery works by creating a temporary, momentary distraction. The subject is distracted with flattery and also by concealing the intent or meaning of an idea, proposal, or action. In short, appeal to flattery glazes over a topic. Here's another example of appeal to flattery. Boy, that dress looks fantastic on you. Boss woman Martha, you look incredible. You look so... Person X flatters person Y. Person X says a claim. Y thinks person's X claim is true because of flattery. Looks so attractive. Now, how can I have that promotion? Or these are obvious and likely ineffective examples, meaning neither Martha nor Fred would be duped by such appeal to flatter. flattery. But that's the form of that fallacy. Be wary of it. Here's one more. Hey, bouncer person, you look really strong and handsome. Wow, can you let me into that club now? Obvious appeal to flattery. Appeal to flattery sounds preposterously lame in the above examples, but sometimes it can slip by under one's logical fallacy detection radar. Stay alert for appeal to flattery and disregard that fallacy. Sometimes appeal to flattery can be used for good. You are an intelligent, bright person, therefore you wouldn't randomly eat plants which could be poisonous. That is technically appealing to flattery, but it is sort of looking out for one's interests. After all, some plants are poisonous, others are nourishing and full of helpful nutrients. The malicious form of appeal to flattery is often something like this. You are a popular, intelligent, superb person. Therefore, you should purchase this junk you don't need. That toxically links desirable characteristics or compliments or flattery to a fallacious action, acquiring unnecessary things. Be wary. Not all praise is appealing to flattery. Sometimes someone simply thinks you're smart or handsome or whatever the compliment is, and they say that without any other intention. Don't think that every compliment you give or receive or hear is a form of appealing to flattery. That itself would be a logical fallacy. Sometimes a spade is just a spade, a cigar is just a cigar, and someone is simply genuinely complimenting you, being praiseworthy. But do, however, be on alert for appeal to flattery, especially when it coincides with some form of agreement, suggestion, command, or direction. Appeal to pity, also known as argumentum misericordiam. Technical form. Event M is presented to induce pity or guilt. Therefore, event N is true. Obviously, the technical form of appeal to pity is flawed. Here are a few examples. A. I worked 10 years on this book and you won't publish it. I will feel so miserable if you don't publish this book. Come on, you must publish my book because I'll feel wretched if you don't. B. The man is a paraplegic. He has no legs. He has been crippled for 18 years. How could he possibly have said an insult to anyone? Now, obviously with number B, there's one's physical capacity. As long as one can use their vocal cords, is more or less irrelevant to one's capacity to be vulgar or vilifying. Saying someone is handicapped and paraplegic and therefore couldn't have walked 80 kilometers is logical, but saying that someone couldn't insult someone simply because of them being paraplegic is illogical and a feeble example of appealing to flattery. Okay, with number A, the desperation to have the book published and the duration of time one worked on the book are not valid considerations for a publisher to publish a book. The criteria for publishing a book is based on A, the quality of the book, how well it is written, and with proper grammar and punctuation, and B, the suitability of the book for the kinds of books the publisher publishes. Number A is a more catchy form of appealing to pity, but it is a logical fallacy nevertheless. Appeal to pity is, unfortunately, used a lot and is heinously manipulative and downright evil. Appealing to pity is exploiting a person's feelings of guilt or pity to sway a subject to support or agree with an argument that is invalid or against one's wishes. By the way, you often see parents committing logical fallacies to their kids to get them to do things. An example of appeal to pity is, you should go to bed at 8:15 because there are some orphans who don't even have a bed. That may be true, and some orphans or some people, but one not having a bed is irrelevant to someone else's requirement of going to bed at a certain time. One could argue, hey, some people sleep in hammocks or in twin beds or queen king-size beds or even on mattresses or on water beds or on the floor. but the conditions of restful recuperation in other people is irrelevant to the time one should have restful recuperation and sleep with themselves. Wishful thinking. The logical fallacy of wishful thinking basically is, I want M to be true so much, therefore M must be true. One's wishful desiring for something to be true has little bearing on its inherent validity. However, it is important to wish for and imagine things to later make them true and real, for them to become reality. The controversy of wishful thinking. Wishful thinking or thinking positively can in instances have promising results. One example of this is the Pygmalion effect, from Shaw's Pygmalion, where a phonetics professor trains a bedraggled Cockney flower girl to appear and sound like an eloquent duchess at an ambassador's garden party. The Pygmalion effect is where expectations placed on something, a person, a book, a film, a place, an event, cause that thing to excel. Personally, the Pygmalion effect doesn't work with me, and it doesn't work with certain people as well, because expectations often cause me to shut down. The opposite of a Pygmalion effect would be where you see a film, for example, don't expect much of it, and it ends up being incredible. The Pygmalion effect applied to the same example would be having such outrageously high expectations of a film that upon seeing it, you experience it much better and more enjoyable than it is. Wishful thinking, I would argue, is much more constructive than destructive. Wishful thinking is using fantasy and imagination to make decisions more so than evidence or what's realistic. Imagination is important to achieving dreams because one first has to imagine them. And if you only worked with realism or past evidence, achieving dreams wouldn't be able to accelerate above a dopey pattern. So using fantasy and imagination is something I applaud, herald, and recommend. Do imagine and fantasize. At the very least, your brain will understand that such visualizations are important regardless of how realistic they are. However, wishful thinking is, as a fallacy, is 100%, fallacious. Basically, it holds the form I want or wish P to be true or false, therefore P is true or false. Wishful something, as anyone knows, does not make the wish true or false. However, being honest with oneself with what one does want is crucial to making said wishes reality. Conclusively, my final thoughts on wishful thinking are this. Do visualize, imagine, and fantasize. You can never achieve a reality that you want unless you have, at the very least, visualized it crisply. Visualizing and imagining are important to, at the very least, identifying things you need or want, with relationships, romance, career, health, productivity, and more. However, don't blur an imagination with reality. Don't think, hey, I imagine N, so N is true. That's wishful thinking, and that's the wishful thinking fallacy. Therefore, do imagine and visualize happy, awesome, superb things, and then always say to yourself, hey, those are imaginings. They are things that have not yet been implemented into my reality yet, but may become reality. At least I have imagined and have a decent understanding of some things I need, desire, and or want. Moving on. Why appealing to emotion is a destructive fallacy. It should be very clear to you now, dear reader, how using emotion fallaciously is so destructive. Emotions are normal and natural and good, and without emotions, life would not be very real. However, committing the fallacy of appealing to emotion, like hijacking and warping emotions in a very destructive and dangerous way, is unwise. Constructively using logic and emotions in decision making. Emotions are important. There have been studies of some people who had something weird going on in their brain and they lacked the ability to experience emotion at times. There was one study of a lawyer who was so freakishly logical, practically everything he did involved only reason and logic. That's great, but for making decisions and deciding what he liked, it was almost impossible without at least a dash or dollop of emotion. In other words, emotions are important in decisions. Basically, appealing to emotion is having emotion override a logical, compelling argument in a way that is not true. However, having emotion assist in a decision is important and acceptable. Example, should I eat a salad or a granola bar? I feel like eating both. Logically, one might say that a salad is healthier or a granola bar requires less preparation time, so eating both would take more time to prepare than just a granola bar, or be not as healthy as just a salad. But hey, if you feel like a granola bar and salad, then use emotion in that situation. Using motion in that situation seems perfectly acceptable. Only when emotion derails someone from making lucid decisions is it a problem. Appealing to emotion is the exploitation of emotion to manipulate. However, while appealing to emotion is malignant, simply making a decision because you like something is natural and acceptable. Things one likes may not always be logically understood at times. Sometimes logic can convince you to do something that's not in your best interest, or emotion can sometimes get you to do something that doesn't benefit you, either in instances. Best to utilize logic and emotion appropriately. They're both essential for achieving dreams and having a clear, functional mind. Fallacy of composition and division. Fallacy of composition. Too long didn't read. If you add true or quality or operational things together, the combined mixture isn't always true or quality or operational. The logical fallacy of composition and its soon to be discussed polar opposite, fallacy of division, is an interesting logical fallacy. It is not as often heinously manipulative like appeal to emotion often is, so it's a good fallacy to study next. In other words, as a break from the preposterously manipulative fallacies of appeal to emotion. Technical form of fallacy of composition. Thing A is composed of things N, M, and O. N, M, and O by themselves are quality and awesome and true. Therefore, thing A is quality and awesome and true. Counterargument. The components of something may be true or individually functional, but they may not operate well combined. Example. I love granola bars, salad, fish, and energy drinks. Therefore, I'll put them all in a blender and drink the resulting fish granola salad energy drink beverage, and it will be tasty. That is a fallacy of composition because the combined individually tasty ingredients would taste repulsive. Another example is four musicians play beautifully individually. They each have tremendous musical competence playing their double bass, viola, violin, and cello. Combined as a quarter, they must sound incredible. Quartet. That may be fallacy of composition. The musicians may play well individually, but may not sound harmonious together in a quartet. Conclusively, sometimes combining things leads to a combination mixture that is true and or desirable. But just because things work well individually doesn't mean combining them is valid. In other words, individually, some things, in the above examples, food and music, may be superb, but not everything is universally compatible with everything else. Fallacy of division. Too long didn't read. If a whole is true, or quality are operational, then each of its individual parts must share the same attributes as that single whole. Technical form of fallacy of division. Thing A is super and or true and is composed of things N, M, and O. Therefore, things N, M, and O by themselves must be superb and or true. In short, fallacy of division strips a quality inherent to a whole and applies it to each of the components of that whole. Sometimes this is true. Sometimes a computer that operates well has equally well-functioning and high-quality components. For example, however, here's an example of the fallacy of composition. I just had a superbly nutritious meal of fish, salad, multivitamins, and a big glass of water. If I drink tons of water, I'll get omega-3 fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and important nutrients from drinking water because, after all, water was a part of that nutritious meal. That is obviously invalid, but is a good example of the fallacy of division. Water, while healthy and vital to the body, will not provide you with proteins, vitamins, minerals, nor omega-3 fats, which were from the other components of that meal. I don't mind the fallacy of division and composition because they're almost always used just out of accidentally faulty logic. Said another way, few people intend to utilize fallacy of composition or division to deliberately exploit a subject. Most of the time, fallacy of composition or fallacy of division occurs simply because of unintentionally illogical thinking. Fallacy of false cause, non sequiturs, and syllogisms. The fallacy of a false cause is also known as the non sequitur, or it does not follow in Latin. Technical form, A, B, and C, therefore are. The fallacy of false cause, or a non sequitur, is not that interesting of a logical fallacy because it's simply a conclusion being made from previous premises where the conclusion doesn't follow. The conclusion can't be made from the set premise in a non sequitur. In other words, all forms of logical fallacy are a form of a false cause, in a way, rendering this fallacy itself slightly redundant. In normal, everyday utterances, a non sequitur, a fallacy of false cause, sounds like random, scattered, irrelevant speech, as in, flowers bloom in the spring, leaves fall from deciduous trees in autumn, I want to go swimming. Granted, to some degree, one could relate almost anything to anything with enough roundabout thinking. For example, in the example above, maybe spring and leaves gives a person allergies, and the cleansing feeling of going for a swim is a good remedy to a skin allergy. So the above sentence about spring flowers, autumn leaves, and then seemingly random comment about wanting to swim actually could be related. But typically such a sentence would be a non sequitur, something random that is unrelated to the previous premises. Fallacy of false cause is redundant and very meh, in my opinion, because every fallacy is a form of a non sequitur, of something that does not follow. In other words, fallacy of false cause, being not very interesting, deserves a more technical elaboration. Fallacy of the undistributed middle. Finally, back to the technical fallacy mode. Enough of the blurry logical fallacies like a non sequitur. Actually, fallacy of the undistributed middle is a form of fallacy of false cause, but at least it has more substance to it, but is of course fallacious too. Technical form. All R's are Z's. H is a Z. Therefore, H is an R. Non-fallacy alert. This is slightly similar to the true syllogism of A's are B's, C is an A, therefore C is a B. Non-fallacy alert. In math, this is practically identical to the true transitive property of equality, which is A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. End of non-fallacy alert. Okay, refreshing to see some non-fallacies. So the fallacy of the undistributed middle is quite technical and interesting. Let's select a decent example from which to understand this fallacy. All humans have skin. A shark, which surprisingly does not have scales but rather tough barbed skin, has skin. Therefore, a shark is a human. Obviously, this is false. The species Homo sapiens and the species under the suborder Selachimorpha, under which species of shark are taxonomically found, are not the same species. Sharks and humans both share the phylum Chordata. Because sharks and humans are both chordates, they share the following similarities and are both deuterostomic, meaning second mouth, somewhat disgustingly, as a shark, human, or any deuterostome develops embryonically. Its first body orifice to develop is the anus, and second is the mouth. That's somewhat unsettling, but true of deuterostomes, and thus of sharks and humans. Possess a notochord, basically a rod-shaped body. Both have a post-anal tail for some portion of their life. Humans have a coccyx, and sharks have a dorsal fin. Pharyngeal slits, also known as gills. Believe it or not, human fetuses do have gills, but they evolve into other organs shortly during embryonic development. Okay, moving on from that delightful bit of evolutionary biology, sharks and humans do have those same characteristics of a chordate, but they are not the same species. The undistributed middle is a fairly technical logical fallacy. In it, the middle premise relates to the second part of the first premise, and then a conclusion is illogically drawn between the second and first premise. Here's a simpler example. The sky is blue. The ocean is blue. Therefore, the ocean is the sky. Obviously, no, that's a fallacy. The ocean is a body of water and the sky is the atmosphere. They're connected by the common denominator of the planet Earth, and they share some chemical properties, some similar periodic elements, but are different things. Fallacy of undistributed middle is very similar to denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, which were learned about with tremendous detail in the A truth and 2 lies section. To recall, DTA has the form if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Example, if something is human, it is a mammal. A dolphin is not a human. Therefore, a dolphin is not a mammal. That is classic denying the antecedent because both dolphins and humans are mammals. And just to also quickly recall, affirming the consequent, if P, then Q, therefore P. Example, if Fred eats 10 fish fillets, he feels full. Fred feels full. Therefore, Fred ate 10 fish fillets. Fred could feel full for many reasons. He could have drunk a ton of water, or have the flu, or eaten 10 cups of salad and 2 fish fillets of fish, all of which are outside the cause of eating 10 fish fillets. Okay, I went into much more detail of DTA and determining the antecedent and affirming the consequent, because I did so in the truth and 2 lies section, but you can see the similarity to those 2 fallacies and fallacy of the undistributed middle. All 3 of those fallacies are fairly technical. Yay! Okay, back to the undistributed middle. Here's another example. All students wear a uniform. Beatrice wears a uniform, therefore Beatrice is a student. Beatrice could be a frickin' bus driver or an astronaut or a janitor or a pilot. All 4 of those professions have uniforms but are not a student. Again, the fallacy of the undistributed middle basically has the form all N have or are B. M has or is B. Therefore, M has or is N. Fallacy of the undistributed middle takes the second part of the first premise and points out that some unrelated event or thing, M, has that second part of the first premise, and that therefore the unrelated thing M is related to the first part of the original premise. But that, of course, is entirely fallacious. Let's dissect a wee bit of what undistributed means using that previous example. A human has skin. A shark has skin. Therefore, a shark is a human. The second and first premise both refer to animals with skin, but that attribute of having skin doesn't apply to all things that have skin. In other words, it is undistributed. If the syllogism were put, a human is a phylum Chordata, a shark is a phylum Chordata, therefore humans and sharks have or had pharyngeal slits. The conclusion applies to a quality shared by all chordate, and the first and second premise show that both things are chordate. So in this example, the middle is distributed. The middle is what occurs in both premises. So in the above examples, color blue is the middle, and possessing skin is the middle, and whereas uniform is the middle. Using the skin example, how long is this? The middle is the class of things with skin, but the first premise is about humans, and the second premise is about sharks. The two are unconnected and in different subdivisions of things with skin. In the chordate example, the middle term is the phylum Chordata, which is a class distributed to humans and sharks. Using the uniform example, the first premise refers to all students, and all the second refers to someone who wears a uniform. The middle term, what appears in both premises, is wears a uniform, but the first premise references all students, so the attribute of wearing a garment of clothing known as a uniform is undistributed. In other words, it's not really about a uniform. Wearing a uniform is a subcomponent quality of being a student in the above example. Changing that syllogism to all aviators wear uniforms, Beatrice is an aviator, therefore Beatrice wears a uniform. Here the middle is qualities of an aviator. The first premise is something about all aviators, they're wearing a uniform quality. The second premise is about an example of an aviator, and then the conclusion is the division of that all aviators quality, in this case, wearing a uniform. To the second premise instance, Beatrice. Because the middle is undistributed, the premises leads to that valid conclusion. A good way to think of undistributed is the second premise is an example of the first premises class, and the first premise describes a quality that class has. All chordate have pharyngeal slits, so any example of chordate has pharyngeal slits. In the ocean and sky and blue example, there isn't a premise. That includes all things that have the property of blue. Using a different color, if the premise was all things that are orange have the optical light wavelength of 590 nanometers, then one could say that oranges and an orange sunset and orange erasable marker all have the wavelength of 590 nanometers in the color spectrum of optical light. Similarly, all things that have the color property of blue have a wavelength of 475 nanometers. Thus, the blue ocean and blue sky have the color wavelength of 475 nanometers. In those two color examples, the property of orange and blue light is distributed amongst things that have that color, so the characteristic about that color, the wavelength, can be applied. To the examples, instances, premises of those, respectively, orange and or blue things. Okay, I think that's enough for fallacy, a false cause, and the undistributed middle. One might want to review modus ponens, denying the consequent, or if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, for a refreshing break of something that is logically true. Fallacy of begging the question. I don't care much for Aristotle. I gave evidence of Aristotle's idiocy, harshly vilified, and framed him for what he is, an idiot, in this blog post and podcast. However, despite my dislike for that philosopher, I still wanted to cover the fallacy of begging the question, because its origin is Aristotle. It isn't that useful of a logical fallacy to understand, but still interesting to learn about. I wanted to avoid covering anything Aristotelian, but bumped into this one. Begging the question is simply making a conclusion using premises that assume that conclusion. It's kind of a recursive equivocation or circular reasoning. As always, an example helps. The food is tasty because food is delectable. That assumes that the food is tasty or delectable. Basically, a begging the question logical fallacy involves an assumed conclusion where a conclusion lacks evidence. The conclusion may be true, the food may actually be tasty, but that conclusion cannot be logically inferred from a begging the question logical fallacy which lacks evidence. Here's another example. I think she is pretty because she is beautiful. That just sort of a restatement of the premise and sort of begs the question of how is she pretty. Funny enough, I've thought about this, and not to digress too much, I consider pretty to be slightly inferior to beautiful in the category of attractive. I think once someone has reached a certain level of prettiness, they become beautiful, in my humble opinion. But that is just my own personal connotation. But using that connotation, beauty would explain prettiness and wouldn't be necessarily begging the question. Here's an obvious example of begging the question. Again, I don't think begging the question is very clear logical fallacy. No thanks to Aristotle. Here's a definition of it. An argument that improperly assumes as true the very point the speaker is trying to argue for is said in formal logic to beg the question. Space shuttles are superbly advanced because space shuttles have such advanced technology. He is smart because he is so intelligent. It's raining outside because there is precipitation. All of those beg the question are basically used as a synonym twice to describe something. Begging the question almost isn't a logical fallacy because the premise could be true, but also cannot be validly concluded as true. A truth and two lies, modus tollens, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are the two logical fallacies you will learn about now. However, I will present those two logical fallacies by first introducing a non-fallacious, simple, and very useful and valid argument for them. The logical modus tollens. Modus tollens is a valid argument that proves a logical conclusion giving a true premise. I will present modus tollens because the two fallacies that you are now learning very much resemble, but are crucially and vitally different from modus tollens. Thus, if you learn all three, the true and valid modus tollens, and the two nearly identical, closely resembling modus tollens, logical fallacies, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, you will be able to spot the two fallacies more easily and all the while will know a valid argument form to boot. Because the two fallacies you are now learning are frequently used but always will be fallacious, it will be silly to not learn modus tollens. In other words, learning the two logical fallacies, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, but not learning the close resembling valid argument modus tollens would be a bit like studying the east coast of Romania and Bulgaria and the west coasts of Russia and the northern border of Turkey, but not at all mentioning or learning about the Black Sea, the body of water that all the aforementioned borders share. So you will learn one true valid argument and then will have heightened acuity to quickly detect the two closely related but invalid logical fallacies. That's a perfect analogy, true. modest tolerance is not a logical fallacy, but as the Black Sea is not land-based shore, land-based shore, but the two logical fallacies you are now learning share a resemblance to modest tolerance, just as the aforementioned borders are connected to the Black Sea body of water. A truth and two lies. Modus tollens. Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are the two logical fallacies you will learn about now. However, I will present those two logical fallacies by first introducing a non-fallacious, simple, and very useful and valid argument form, the logical modus tollens. Modus tollens is a valid argument that proves a logical conclusion given a true premise. I will present modus tollens because the two fallacies that you are now learning very much resemble, but are crucially and vitally different from modus tollens. Thus, if you learn all three, the true and valid modus tollens, and the two nearly identical, closely resembling modus tollens, logical fallacies, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, you will be able to spot the two fallacies more easily, and all the while will know a valid argument form to boot. Because the two fallacies you're now learning are frequently used, but always will be fallacious, it would be silly to not learn modus tollens. In other words, learning the two logical fallacies, affirm the consequent and denying the antecedent, but not learning the close resembling valid argument modus tollens, would be a bit like studying the east coast of Romania and Bulgaria and the west coast of Russia and the northern boundary of Turkey, but not at all mentioning or learning about the Black Sea, the body of water that all the aforementioned borders share. So you will learn one true valid argument, and then will have heightened acuity to quickly detect the two closely related but invalid logical fallacies. That's a perfectly true analogy. True, modus tollens is not a logical fallacy, just as the Black Sea is not land-based shore, but the two logical fallacies you are now learning share a resemblance to modus tollens, just as the aforementioned borders are connected to the Black Sea body of water. Modus tollens. Modus tollens is not a logical fallacy, but a valid conclusion-proving argument form. In short, in reading this book, you will replace illogical thinking with clear, lucid reasoning, some of which that takes the form of modus tollens. It's the form of if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. It is also called denying the consequent because Q, the consequent, is denied or shown to be false. Once you explore and then solidify your comprehension of that valid argument, you will see what I mean about it closely resembling the two slightly but fundamentally different logical fallacies. I will now present the two logical fallacies and then discuss all three, the one valid argument and two logical fallacies. Denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent has the fallacious form if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. Here's an application of denying the antecedent that seems to have the appearance of truth but is false. It should be noted that this fallacious argument was thought up by the great computer scientist Alan Turing in Computing Machinery and Intelligence. If each man had a definite set of rules of conduct by which he regulated his life, then he would be no better than a machine. There are no such rules, therefore men cannot be machines. In abbreviated forms, if each man had life-regulating conduct rules, he would be a machine. No life-regulating conduct rules exist. Therefore, man is not a machine. Now, the fact that the above is indeed a logical fallacy makes you wonder, then, are human machines? That's an interesting and plausible theory, but concluding that from the fact that the above is a logical fallacy would be itself a logical fallacy. Showing that the above is a denying the antecedent logical fallacy leaves the possibility open that humans are machines, but does not prove that is so. Here's a simpler application of denying the antecedent that is obviously false. If my computer monitor does not show my desktop, then the monitor is not broken. The computer monitor does not show my desktop, therefore the monitor is broken. If the monitor does not show my desktop, there could be a lot of causes of that. The monitor could not be plugged in, but working fine. The monitor could be disconnected from the computer and working fine, but getting no graphic information from the computer. The computer could be displaying an application that hides the desktop, and more. It's safe to assume that denying the antecedent is a bit more alluring and has duped more people than affirming the consequent or ATC, but they are both just as incorrect as 1 plus 4 equals 75. Let's look at the wording of denying the antecedent. P is the antecedent, and it is denied or shown to be false or to not occurred. The consequent Q is then fallaciously assumed to be false, but that is not always the case. It is crucial, but by now quite obvious, to understand that if the conditional premise was phrased if and only if P, then Q, then denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent would not be logical fallacies, but valid arguments. In other words, if and only if P, then Q. If the antecedent P is denied, then one could conclude that Q is also denied because there exists no other way for Q to occur without P. Additionally, if the consequent is affirmed to be true and to have occurred, then it can be concluded that the antecedent P would have occurred because, again, there would be no other way that Q could have occurred without P. Great. However, there is no if and only if in any of these three conditional premises for modus tollens, denying the antecedent, and affirming the consequent. Therefore, modus tollens stands as valid, and denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are logical fallacies and are not true. Conclusively, the way to correctly conclude that the antecedent P did not occur from if P then Q is if Q did not occur. And this is the valid argument of modus tollens, with the two closely resembling denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent dissected out. It can be quite fun and amusing, and I strongly encourage this, to run modus tollens, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent, through some conclusions or theories of your own, and you may discover that some things you thought were true were merely examples of logical fallacies denying the antecedent or affirming the consequent. Many superstitions are based on the logical fallacies of affirming the consequent. For example, if I put strawberry jam on my shoes, then we will win the soccer match. We won the soccer match. Therefore, if I put strawberry jam on my shoes, we will win the soccer match. That's affirming the consequence, but many athletes likely commit a version of this logical fallacy and have a host of odd but fallacious and useless rituals that have little impact on their ability to perform well, other than plausibly increasing their optimism and confidence. Here's another important example of affirming the consequent. If you have a virus, then you feel nauseous. You feel nauseous. Therefore, you have a virus. Obviously, you could be feeling sick on a boat, or you may have food poisoning, or an enormous amount of other nauseating things other than a biological virus. Affirming the consequent is the basis for practically all misdiagnoses. Conclusively, Observe examples of and use modus tollens to affirm conclusions about the antecedent based on the denial of the consequent. Meanwhile, confirm that anytime you see someone affirming the consequent and trying to conclude the truth of the antecedent, or saying that because the consequent didn't occur, that therefore the antecedent didn't occur, that those are both indeed logical fallacies. Another example. If you have anxiety disorder, then you feel nervous. You feel nervous. Therefore, you have anxiety disorder. That is affirming the consequent and is a logical fallacy. Most all of psychiatry is based on affirming the consequent. If the world was rid of logical fallacies, human thought would also be liberated from the toxic, illogical mess that is psychiatry. Logical fallacies are a way of duping yourself and blurring untruth to make you think something is true when it is in fact false. Just as false as 1 plus 4 equals 75, thanks to this chapter, you have now eliminated 2 logical fallacies, and your brain is already functioning more efficiently thanks to the eradication of these 2 cognitive viri. You can use this knowledge of modus tollens and the awareness of the closely resembling affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent to free yourself from superstitions, from invalid, incorrect, fallacious, and untrue diagnoses, and most importantly, to truly observe, make, and understand true logical arguments through the use of modus tollens. Affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent has the fallacious form, if P, then Q. Q, therefore P. You can see why it is wise, prudent, and relevant to learn the valid modus tollens along with the denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent logical fallacies. All 3 of these arguments share the same conditional premise, if P, then Q. Look at this fallacy this way. Couldn't there be more causes for Q? Of course, if I am in Paris, then I am in France. I am in Bretagne, a region of France west of Paris, therefore I am in Paris. That is the logical fallacy applied, and you can see quite clearly that it is not true. If you are familiar with that country, if you are unfamiliar with that country, here's another application of the fallacious affirming the consequent. If you are at the bus stop, you are waiting. You are waiting for the internet connection to upload a file and are nowhere near a bus stop. Therefore, you are at a bus stop. Again, it's quite obvious this is not true. In the form and the 2 examples, there are other causes for Q. If the conditional premise was if and only if P, then Q, and then Q occurred, then P could be concluded as true because the conditional premise states that Q only occurs when P occurs. But if P, then Q, is not if and only if P, then Q. There are 2 more possible causes of Q. That is why affirming the consequent is a logical fallacy. Now you can understand the naming of it. Q is the consequent, and it is affirmed or shown to have occurred. Affirming the consequent outside of an if and only if conditional premise is always a logical fallacy. But do you see how affirming the consequent may appear true in some instances? Here's an application of affirming the consequent that is just as fallacious as the examples above, but is more easily and therefore dangerously misconstrued with the truth. If I am happy, I am smiling. I am smiling, therefore I am happy. A smile is caused by other things other than happiness. I could be smiling for a photo and feel abysmal. If a person had a condition whereby the only way they could use the zygomatic major muscle on their face to pull their lips and cheeks up and could only use the orbicularis oculi muscles to squint their eyes into a contraction that resembles a smile, if and only if they were actually happy, then happiness could be identifiable by a smile. But unless the person has that condition, assuming a person is happy just because of a facial muscular contraction that resembles a smile, is committing the affirming the consequent logical fallacy. You can see now that it is practically imperative to identify the valid argument form of modus tollens to dissect out the logical fallacies of affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. Let's explore why these two fallacies are untrue. The two fallacies. Did that merely whet your appetite or broach your comprehension for understanding the difference between those two lies and a truth? If so, then here are a few more examples. First, we'll start with one that's true. Conditional premise. If I'm drinking out of this cup, then there is fluid in it. First off, is that true? Yes. There's no way to drink out of a cup without there being a fluid in it. You could be acting, but acting is not the same as actually drinking a fluid, and you can't drink solids or air, so there would have to be a fluid in that cup that you were drinking out of. Premise. There is not water in that cup. Therefore, I am not and cannot be drinking out of it. That is true, and that is our good friend modus tollens. Righto. Moving on to the two fallacious brethren-in-law of modus tollens. Same conditional premise. If I'm drinking out of this cup, then there is water in it. Premise. I am not drinking out of the cup. Therefore, there is not water in it. What logical fallacy is that? It is none other than the deceptively vile denying the antecedent. Now, is this false? Of course it is. I could pour a cup of tea and leave it on the counter. The tea could get cold, and then I could pour it out. There was a fluid in the cup, but it was not drunk. Affirming the antecedent does not disprove the consequent. Affirming that I didn't drink the tea does not prove that there is no fluid in the cup. Denying the antecedent is well denied. Moving on. Same conditional premise. If I am drinking out of this cup, then there is fluid in it. Premise. There is fluid in the cup. Therefore, I am drinking out of that cup. Is that necessarily true? Of course not. I could pour a nice cup of tea, and then an enormous fly could land in it, and then a bird could crap a steamy dangle of bird poo right in my tea. Am I drinking out of that cup? Heck no, absolutely not, good sir. There is fluid in it, but I am most certainly not drinking out of that cup. Affirming the consequent is denied and disproven. Again, with non-if and only if traditional conditional premises, denying the consequent is the only way to prove anything. In this case, the antecedent, thanks to modus tollens. One more example to solidify and anchor in the awesome distinction between truth, modus tollens, and lies, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, or at the very least, veracity and fallacy. This time, I'll involve my beloved feline friend, whom, despite a reputation for intelligence, and cats truly are quite intelligent, can be slightly less than logical. If my cat is hungry, he will eat his food. His food was not eaten. Therefore, he was not hungry. Okay, this is interesting. In this affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent? No, it is neither. This is denying the consequent, which is none other than modus tollens. But is it true? No, it is false. But importantly, not because of modus tollens, but rather because of the formation of the sentence content. My cat could be starving, but the wet cat food could be rotten and moldy, or a huge crate could have fallen, preventing my cat from getting to the food. Meanwhile, his stomach is gnawing at him and he's meowing ferociously at his hunger. So what is happening? Is the logical architecture of all that all that is good and true and clear in the world crumbling? Will I suddenly step outside and look up to see the ground and look down to see if it's cloudy? Will logical fallacies have victory over truth? Will hosts of logical evil flood into the stronghold of truth and logic, and will all that is good that crumple? Nope, of course not. Here's what's happened. Unless the drinking then fluid in the cup conditional premise The initial conditional premise wasn't necessarily true to begin with. My cat could be a picky eater, or the other two reasons stated above. We will radically alter and change, much more than merely tweak, our conditional premise to ensure it is true, but this is a good reminder. For any of this chapter to be true, for modus tollens to be valid, and for denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent to be false, the initial conditional premise must always be true. Good times and crucial to remember. Always test that the conditional premise is always true before proceeding with evaluating the logic or non-logic in the rest of the conclusion. Here's a few considerations. If my cat's food was quickly eaten, then he was hungry. Is that true? Not really, because maybe my cat is stuffed beyond belief, but he fears not getting food for days, so he wolfs down what is in front of him for fear of not being fed for a while. In this case, my cat ate his food quickly, not out of hunger, but of a future fear of not being fed. By the way, I should mention that I give my cat a treat of milk and wet food and dry treats regularly, and he's very healthy. There were no felines harmed in the writing of this book. Let's radically alter our conditional premise again. If my cat always has access to his food, never gets injured, the food never molds and is always edible, no one else eats the food, and my cat only eats the food if he is hungry, then if my cat is hungry, the food will be eaten. The food is not eaten, therefore my cat is not hungry. The befuddling world of the feline species seems to make this analysis of logic very strained, but alas, I think we have a victory. Is the initial conditional premise true? Yes, because there's no injury to my cat. Nobody else gobbles up his food. His food is always reachable and accessible, and he can never get injured in any way that makes the food inaccessible or indigestible. And he only actually eats the food if he is actually hungry, meaning he never eats the food out of boredom or fear of not eating. Then finally, if the food is eaten, then my cat was hungry is a valid conditional premise. Then the consequent is denied, and we conclude the antecedent, my cat is hungry, is false as well. That is modus tollens applied to a true conditional premise, and it holds up as true because of all those variables are true. The uninjurable cat, the unspoilable food, and all that. Then the only way that the food could be eaten would be if my cat was indeed hungry. If we deny the consequent and show the food was not eaten, then we prove that my cat was not hungry. Okay, this is a slightly humorous example. I was concerned about including it because I dislike humor in a discussion of logic. Logic is serious and digital, black and white, off or on, right or wrong, most of the time. At advanced levels, it appears to be slightly analog, but is still calculable and black and white are true or false. However, it illustrates that in some situations, a conditional premise can require a lot of truths to exist and be true. It's safe to say that making a conditional premise about a feline may be challenging. So if you're a lawyer on a case involving a cat or someone trying to understand the feline species, you may need to ensure a lot of extra variables are true before creating a valid conditional premise. You've been forewarned. Let's quickly plug in the two logical fallacies. Denying the antecedent, my cat is not hungry, therefore the food is not eaten. But wait, that could be true. Again, it's challenging to have a well-formed conditional premise when cats are involved. We may discover even more that logic and cats are frequently found in the same sentence. Let's try again with the conditional premise. Modus tollens. See ball leads to being scared, also known as if my cat sees the red ball, he gets scared. Not Q, he is not scared. Therefore, he didn't see the red ball. Denying the antecedent, not P, he didn't see the red ball, therefore he is not scared, affirming the consequent. Do we finally have a truthful modus tollens and illogical denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent? Yes, we do. In regards to modus tollens, if my cat is not scared and the presence of the red ball always scares him, then there's no way he saw the red ball. Moving on, denying the antecedent says not seeing the red ball, therefore not scared. Not so. My cat could be scared about not being fed. He could see an enormous saber-toothed raccoon charging him. He could fear that he will never be pet again. All three of those fears, no food, raccoon, and no petting, would indeed scare my cat, but none of them involve the red ball. Therefore, concluding that because my cat didn't see the red ball, that he is not scared is the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent and is false. Denying the antecedent again proven to be false as always. Moving on to the affirming the consequent. My cat is scared, therefore he saw the red ball. Again, we just illustrated above that my cat could be scared because of the ferocious saber-toothed raccoon or his concerns and future feeding and petting sessions. The presence of fear of being scared, or Q, does not prove the presence of the antecedent, P, having seen the red ball. Affirming the consequent is again shown as illogical and 100% a fallacy. Booyah. To conclude, denying the consequent, showing that my cat isn't afraid, is the only way to prove that he did indeed not see the red ball. Thanks modus tollens and thanks logic. Q, my cat is scared, therefore he saw the red ball. Modus ponens. You just studied the arguably more complex but valid modus tollens and the two closely related denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent logical fallacies. I just wanted to include modus ponens because it is related to those three, the truth and the two lies, and it itself is a truth or a valid argument form in logic. Learning modus tollens, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, without learning modus ponens would be more moderately silly. Modus ponens is technical form, if P then Q. P, therefore Q. Example, if I go to London, I will be in England. I went to London, therefore I am in England. One more example, even though it's not really necessary with modus ponens, because it's so straightforward, modus tollens is much more technical and interesting. If I'm attending a concert at the Sydney Opera House, I'm in Australia. I'm attending a concert at the Sydney Opera House, therefore I'm in Australia. About as straightforward as you can get. Modus ponens, in addition to being highly boring, is however a valid argument form. Modus tollens, denying the consequent, is more technical and interesting but equally as valid. And denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent are, however, obviously logical fallacies. Good to identify those two truths, modus ponens and modus tollens, and those closely resembling two truths, two lies, denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. Argumentum ad hominem, also known as argument against the man. Diagnosis. Argumentum ad hominem is the fallacy committed when one blurs a true or false statement with whom utters it. Whomever communicates the statement is irrelevant to inherent logical validity or invalidity of the statement. Being a very common mind virus, argumentum ad hominem is frequently utilized either voluntarily or involuntarily, with or without someone's cognizance of using the fallacy, and is often overlooked as a fallacy. Because of its frequency of use, argumentum ad hominem has noxiously blended in with common conversation and often appears as pseudo-proof of an invalid belief. Argumentum ad hominem is sort of like poisoning the well, in that one aims to pollute the utterances of a person by denigrating the person themselves, or in contrast, if someone heralds and praises a person and speaks of how magnificent a person is, The notion that what they say must be true is also an example of argumentum ad hominem. In logic, whom utters something is irrelevant. What matters is the utterance true? Argumentum ad hominem fallaciously blends and blurs the utterer, the person saying a statement, with the statement itself. If a statement is true or false is up to the statement itself. Any person or thing, a talking cow, a banana-eating gorilla, the world's worst liar, the world's greatest liar, the most truthful person ever to exist, the status quo, who sometimes lies and sometimes tells the truth, could say a statement that is true, and then it would be true, or false, and then it would be false. Whom communicates the statement is completely irrelevant to the validity and truth of the statement. Scenarios of the epidemic. Epidemic Scenario 1. Mary is the most amazing person ever. She aces all of her tests. She is friends with everyone. She donates all of her money to charity. She spends 22 hours a day helping the elderly. She said the moon was previously part of the sun. Because Mary is so great, it must be true. Dissecting this scenario. The moon was previously part of the earth before a chunk of it broke off. Mary's statement, despite her being an amazing person, is false. It doesn't matter how many horrible things or how many amazing things Mary does. A statement that is true, and a statement that is false is false. Epidemic Scenario 2. Robert is a sniveling, conniving cheat. Do you know when he played poker last week, he put cards up his sleeve, played a false deck, and even tried to distract us, and then swiped chips from the table? He's the most deceitful person I've ever met. He said that our solar system is a unary star system, so there's no way that's true. Dissecting this scenario. Robert's statement is true. Binary star systems, for example, have 2 suns. Our solar system has 1 sun, so it is a unary star system. Robert may be a cheat and deceitful person, but whoever says that what he says must always be untrue is committing an argumentum ad hominem fallacy, believing that the solar system is not a unary star system because the poker cheat Robert said that statement would be committing the logical fallacy of argumentum ad hominem. Epidemic Scenario 3. I don't like him, so I don't believe what he says about calculating values in parentheses before doing addition and subtraction in a mathematical equation. Dissecting this scenario. Your amount of like or dislike for a person is irrelevant to the validity of their statement. The above unnamed disliked person uttered a true statement. Parentheses, exponents, multiplication and division, and then finally addition and subtraction is the correct sequence of doing mathematical operations in an equation. To avoid committing argumentum ad hominem, you must abandon your like or dislike for a person and judge and evaluate their statements, not the person. However, it must be in your best interest to avoid people whom you dislike altogether in the first place. We'll elaborate on that form of protection in this next section. Immunization and prognosis. It's important, but because of its pervasiveness in media, politics, common conversation, and other situations, quite challenging to immunize oneself against the infection of argumentum ad hominem. An important thing to note is that untrue statements uttered by someone praised, true statements uttered by someone denigrated, are both argumentum ad hominem. If you are wary and cautious to listen to the actual statement's logic, or lack thereof, and engage completely objectively to whom says the statement, you will rarely commit the argumentum ad hominem logical fallacy and will properly evaluate erroneous statements as false and correct statements as true. Thus, the ultimate resolution to immunizing oneself against this logical fallacy is disregarding the communicator of the message. Note, in order to protect the clarity of your mind, you often need to judge a person and determine how much you trust them. Simply not trusting and then avoiding or ignoring a person and his or her statements is not committing argumentum ad hominem. That is simply avoiding cognitive infection and protecting yourself. If there's someone you dislike or don't trust, you could logically evaluate every single sentence they utter and disregard and dislike and distrust of the person to avoid committing a logical fallacy. However, a much safer practice would lead to a more enriched and healthier mind would be to avoid that person and his or her statements altogether. The French say, it is better to prevent than to heal. And if you know someone who frequently lies, you could put on your argumentum ad hominem detection lens and evaluate every statement that communicate with objectivity. But would that be worth your time? Likely not. If you do find yourself listening to someone whom you consider to be distrustful, if you evaluate what they say objectively, disregarding the utterer, you won't commit argumentum ad hominem. But wouldn't it be better for you just to avoid distrustful people in the first place? Likely so. Conclusion to argumentum ad hominem. You are now equipped to identify, dissect, and detect the argumentum ad hominem, but that said, often it is best to simply avoid people you distrust to prevent gateway infections of other logical fallacies. People whom you know are distrustful often use a multitude of logical fallacies. Someone committing an argumentum ad hominem logical fallacy will often consciously or unconsciously have a large variety of mind viruses infecting their thinking as well. In short, if someone frequently commits an argumentum ad hominem fallacy, or any fallacy for that matter, it can be hypothesized that they will likely be committing other types of logical fallacies as well. In short, be objective, disregard the utterer of a statement, but if you know someone to be distrustful, do best to avoid him or her statements. Next, we'll learn about causality and post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Causality and post hoc, ergo propter hoc. I will commence the unraveling and annihilation of this fallacy by immediately translating the Latin to English and sharing a similar logical fallacy. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore because of this. The closely related fallacy known as cum hoc, ergo propter hoc references the simultaneous occurrence of two incidents and illogically assumes that they are related because of their simultaneous occurrence. The literal translation is, with this, therefore because of this. Okay, now that we've covered semantics, on with the explanation. This one is big. Let me commence by first saying that because of its alluring appearance of veracity, it is very common to accidentally commit the logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc. But of course, frequency of committing a logical fallacy has zero effect on its validity. It is still a logical fallacy. Causality is the study of what causes what, and it very much interests me. You go out in the cold sopping wet and stay cold, you likely catch a common cold. The relation of catching an illness in that case is likely related to stressing your physiological homeostasis, the body's ability to maintain equilibrium, with certain systems like cardiovascular and respiratory, for example. And in the example, temperature are physiological stressors that increase the chance of one catching a mild illness. It's tempting to make conclusions of causality simply because of temporal proximity. Whoa, what does that sentence mean? It means it's typical to wrongly conclude that event B occurred because of event A, simply because the two events occurred one after the other. But if I put on a green shirt, then go outside wet in the cold, and catch a cold, one could use post hoc ergo propter hoc to wrongly conclude that wearing a green shirt made me get sick. That's obviously preposterous, ridiculous, irrational, and incorrect. That's a very obvious example of post hoc ergo propter hoc being a fallacy. But the fallacy becomes complex and criticized in other contexts, especially with cum hoc ergo propter hoc. American statistician and Edward Rolfe Tuft says, in regards to correlation does not imply causation, that correlation is causation, but it surely is a hint. Indeed, at times it may be a hint, but as with the green shirt example above, correlation, or the temporal proximity of two events, is obviously neither causation nor hint, because getting sick is completely unrelated to shirt color. Moving on. T. Edward Dahmer, in his brilliant book, Attacking Faulty Reasoning, gives an example of someone using the faulty and broken irrational conclusion of post hoc ergo propter hoc. I can't help but think that you are the cause of this problem. We never had any problem with the furnace until you moved into the apartment. The manager of the apartment house, on no stated grounds other than temporal priority of the new tenant's occupancy, has that the tenant's presence has some causal relationship to the furnaces becoming faulty. In the above example, a landlord tried to blame a tenant for a malfunctioning contraption. But of course, the correlation of the tenant moving into the apartment house is not evidence for causation of the broken furnace. C. Knowing logical fallacies can prevent you from getting blamed and can even save, or occasionally earn, you money. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is a fancy synonym for leaping to conclusions, really. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is making a causal conclusion without carefully investigating and scrutinizing cause and effect of a phenomenon. If you logically evaluate and scientifically observe two events, you much less likely commit post hoc ergo propter hoc, and more likely are you to understand valid causality. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is the biggest obstacle in one's ability to comprehend causality of how and why one thing occurred, and if the occurrence of event B was in fact caused by a previous event A. I wore a green shirt, had a tasty, nutritious meal, and then felt nourished. I bet wearing a green shirt made me feel nourished, so any time I wear a green shirt, I will feel nourished and full. That's classic post hoc ergo propter hoc. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is one of the most common fallacies that leads to misdiagnoses or incorrect medical diagnoses. For example, without getting too medically technical, Fran went to a local restaurant, ate a meal, and felt under the weather. He then experienced nausea and vomiting. He had felt a bit queasy before going to the restaurant, so he assumed he had a simple 24-hour flu, which is the body's immune system eventually took care of. Scrutinizing causality is at times like solving a mystery. Did Fran actually have the flu, or was it non-viral food poisoning from the meal at the restaurant? Jumping to either of these conclusions without more evidence or facts would be committing a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Let's say Fran went to the same restaurant, ate the same meal, and on 3 consecutive occasions had the same 24-hour flu-like nausea. Then one could very likely conclude that the digestive upset was caused by food poisoning, a food allergy, and or something directly related to the food he ate and not some airborne virus. That example is fairly simple and obvious, but other more nuanced examples can be less obvious. Overall, merely maintaining cognizance of post hoc ergo propter hoc and genuinely questioning to see if you can accurately determine a cause from an effect immunizes you from fallacies and keeps your mind clean and clear. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc. Closely related to post hoc ergo propter hoc, PHEPH, in a way that only differs in timing, a temporal variation, is cum hoc ergo propter hoc, Latin for with this, therefore because of this. In other words, there is a space of time with post hoc ergo propter hoc between a cause and an effect, and that temporal time space is 0 with cum hoc ergo propter hoc. In other words, with that, there is both a cause and effect, like there is with post hoc ergo propter hoc. But with cum hoc ergo propter hoc, the cause and effect are practically instantaneous. Thus, those two logical fallacies of post hoc ergo propter hoc and cum hoc ergo propter hoc are very similar, not differing in duration of time, only differing in duration of time, some duration, 0 duration between the supposed cause and effect. Naturally, every simultaneous occurrence is not a cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. If someone brushes up against an odd-looking botanical species and then gets a rash, it's likely that that plant caused the rash. Similarly, if one drinks some kind of remedial herbal tea and feels more calm instantly, it could be logical to deduce that the tea, in fact, created the state of calmness and that is not a cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. The common phrasing of cum hoc ergo propter hoc is correlation does not imply causation. Here's some examples of invalid conclusions drawn using the cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. A man has a heart attack while sleeping. It's very unlikely that the act of sleeping caused a myocardial infarction. The heart attack occurred when the person's beta waves were active and was asleep, but the state of sleep didn't cause the infarction. A person fainted and had a heart attack. Heart attacks almost always occur at moments of high blood pressure, and syncope, fainting, occurs from hypotension or low blood pressure. So it's very likely that fainting was related to the low blood pressure circulatory state of fainting and was more likely related to some physiological conditions such as diabetes or short-term air pollution, for example. One common occurrence with a post hoc ergo propter hoc or a cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy is something called a lurking variable, C, or a third factor other than the supposed cause A and effect B. Here are a couple of superb examples of a lurking variable being the cause of something other than a supposed cause. Going to sleep near a toilet is correlated with waking up with a headache. Therefore, sleeping near a toilet causes headaches. The cause A, sleeping near a toilet, is fallaciously linked to the variable B, waking up with a headache, which is more likely is C, the lurking variable, which would be that people who fall asleep next to a toilet are likely highly intoxicated and have been vomiting. Their proximity to a porcelain toilet has nothing to do with awaking with a headache, but rather the drunkenness that caused them to fall asleep near the toilet. So the sleeping near toilet causing headaches is not a valid correlation and is an example of post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. The store sold more ice cream cones and at the same time the rate of drowning increased. Therefore, ice cream cones causes drowning deaths. Again, what is going on is a cum hoc ergo propter hoc or post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. It is not the ice cream cone sales themselves, but the time of year that causes drowning. Ice cream is sold in summer months, and if many people are buying ice cream cones, it means many people are outside and will likely swim in the warm weather where some of them drown. So it is A, not being good swimmers, and B, the sheer fact that more people are swimming that leads to the increased drowning rate. The fact that high number of people swimming because of warmer weather, group purchases, ice cream cones, or any other food or drink is practically irrelevant. It's the high number of people swimming that causes an increased rate of drowning, not random food they ate. If people all decide to wear the color beige during the summer and someone noticed an increased rate of drowning, it would be cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy to assume that wearing beige caused drowning. Rather, it's the fact that beige was worn in the summer, and the summer timing coincides with more poor swimmers swimming and some drowning. Beige clothing and ice creams are not correlated with drowning rate. Here's another great example of post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. As a city's air pollution increases, simultaneously the levels of people being overweight increases. Therefore, pollution causes obesity. Nope, people who gluttonously chow down on junk food and whom are also obese also tend to be equally as indifferent to and wasteful of energy consumption. It's the personality type of a person, not the pollution. Populations of people who gorge themselves on food become overweight, tend to be equally as careless with energy consumption, and also use electricity wastefully, which causes an increase of air pollution. So someone whom is more apt to be careless with one's nutritional health is more apt to be careless with energy conservation. And it's that destructive recklessness, in addition to nutrition and energy consumptions, that causes the increased air pollution. The air pollution doesn't cause poor nutritional health. It's the disposition of certain people that cause poor nutritional health and lack of energy conservation, which causes pollution. Is one more example, but one that is more obvious. Whenever I taste lemonade, I start sneezing. Therefore, lemonade causes me to sneeze. It is practically impossible to discern what the lurking variable C is from just the above A and B. And by the way, there isn't always a lurking variable. Sometimes A actually genuinely does cause the effect of B in a non-fallacious way. But consider this detail. Whenever I make lemonade, I first take a walk through fields to get a lemon tree, where I pick lemons and then walk back and make the lemonade. By the time I get back and make lemonade, I am sneezing. What is the most likely going on here is there is a lurking variable that getting lemons in a field full of pollen is what causes an allergic reaction, and the allergens cause the sneezing, not the lemonade making. Not going in a field full of pollen and making lemonade in the above situation would verify if sneezing occurred. It likely wouldn't go into a field full of pollen spores. It's the pollen from the field that caused the allergy, which caused the sneezing. The lemonade making occurred just after that, but is unrelated to sneezing. Thus, the above example is a classic post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. The valid conclusion is only that going in fields full of pollen causes some people to have an allergic reaction, which involves sneezing, and anything you do after or during the allergic reaction is unrelated to the allergy. I like understanding that above logical fallacy and the lurking variable of a more or less gluttonous, reckless disposition. Good reminder to invest in solar panels for one. To me, properly understanding causality without the logical fallacies of post hoc ergo propter hoc and cum hoc ergo propter hoc, logically and validly comprehending causality between two events, is one of the most rewarding parts of logic and immunization to logical fallacies. Conclusively, avoiding cum hoc ergo propter hoc and also by avoiding post hoc ergo propter hoc, one will be more accurately capable of understanding causality and voluntarily repeating delightful causes that have the effect of positive outcomes. Aligning and centering your mind to avoid using the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc and eliminating that buggy, invalid thinking enables you to make clean, reasonable conclusions about causality and about what caused what. You experience stress? Great. What really caused that? Knowing what caused the stress or the joy or the sense of reward after immunizing yourself to post hoc ergo propter hoc enables you to then repeat the cause to get the effective success or whatever positive outcome was, or will be. Complex question. This one is fairly straightforward. It is a common logical fallacy that is used mens rea, or with a state of mind of intent. Usually is sort of harmless, but is restricting and a logical fallacy. Complex reasoning, also known as compound questioning, also known as false bifurcation, or a restrictive question, where more options in fact exist. Technical form. A question that restrictively implies A and or B and or C when really more options or truths than A, B, or C exist. Here's another one. What is Billy's sister's name? This is a complex question because it implies that Billy has a sister, which Billy may not have. Anytime an artificial restriction is used, the question is considered to be one of a complex questioning fallacy. Is Samantha on the first or second floor? Is an artificial restriction. Samantha could be on a different floor or not in the same building at all. Some complex questions that involve multiple assumptions can be valid. For example, did you take a bus when in London in the UK? That implies that the UK has buses, true, and that London is in the UK, true. So that is a valid but complex question. Here's an invalid complex question. Did you take a bus in London when in France? That implies that there are buses in London, true, and that London is in France, false. So that is an invalid complex question. Here's another complex but invalid question. Let's understand that a package was not shipped and someone asks, did you ship the package to Berlin, UK, or Kent, France? There, the shipping of the package, not true, and the destination, Berlin, is in Germany, not the UK, and Kent is a region in the UK, not France, are neither true. So if all presuppositions are true, and neither of the presuppositions are controversial, then it is a valid, non-loaded, complex question. If one or more presupposition of a complex question are invalid, then the complex question is invalid, and if a presupposition of a complex question is controversial, then it is considered a loaded complex question. As you can see, complex questions are kind of a quasi-form of logical fallacy. Loaded question. A loaded question is a specific type of a complex question, but which contains controversial or loaded presuppositions and is almost always phrased in a way so that a direct yes or no is incriminating to whomever the question is being asked. For example, Billy, were you 4 or 2 hours out past curfew? That's a loaded and complex and false bifurcation question because Billy may not have been out past curfew or out longer past curfew. The same question would not be loaded if it was already established that Billy was out past curfew. The questions, how many times did you forget to run a virus check on your computer, and at what time did you almost drown in the pool, both imply respectively that someone forgot to run a virus check and that someone almost drowned. But a direct answering of those questions, providing the number of times a virus check was forgotten or providing the time at the near drowning, implies the presupposed event occurred. So if those events didn't occur, virus check was never forgotten, and near drowning never occurred, the loaded question couldn't be directly answered because a direct answer wouldn't be true. I guess a direct but still true answer in which neither of those presupposed events occurred would be 0 times or no time because neither of those happened. Loaded questions appear in legal cross-examinations of a witness. For example, at what time did you see the person walk in front of the car? The person may not have walked out in front of the car, but it is presupposed in a loaded question. Usually, loaded questions are paraphrased as yes/no questions, where answering yes or not would make the presupposed thing to be true, as in, when the person walked out in front of the car, did you scream? If the person answers yes or no, it implies that the person saw a person walk out in front of a car. Usually loaded questions are asked to attempt to move or verify a presupposition, and the actual direct answer of the question is often unimportant. Here's one final example of a loaded question two actually, that were asked to me. I questioned including them because they're moderately embarrassing and offensive, but decided to include them anyway. In 2006, I was temporarily living out of the car. I had lost my wallet and inquired at some houses on the street if they had found a wallet. Someone called the police, which wasn't very helpful in my search for the wallet, probably concerned that I was trying to rob a house, but I was genuinely searching for my wallet. I guess I may have looked stressed and disheveled from living out of car temporarily, and the police officers asked me, "When was the last time you shot up?" I was appalled, sickened, and scared by the question. I assumed they meant drugs. I almost started crying because I was so overwhelmed by the question. I hate drugs, and the fact that I was asked that unnerving, disturbing, and appalling, insulting question. Anyways, the police officers saw my disgust and fear of the question, and I guess that's the response they wanted. Instead of asking, "Do you do drugs?" they presupposed that, and that incorrect presupposition was that unnerving, disturbing, and appallingly insulting in the form of the loaded question. When was the last time you shot up? The direct answering of that would be never, assuming that one never did drugs. Police officers and legal people and people use loaded questions a lot. The second and last and personal embarrassing example of question was in 2010 when I was living in a relative's house and got upset about not being in the UK. I started crying and was quite distraught. They called the police, and a policeman asked me, "When was the last time you were hospitalized?" I had not been hospitalized, except for an infected foot a few months ago, but they presupposed that I was a lunatic or mentally unstable, which, like the other question, was unnerving, disturbing, and appallingly insulting. I answered that I had been hospitalized for an infected foot in Australia and 3 months before, but the presupposition of mental instability, to say the least, stung and was insulting. So loaded questions often have insulting presuppositions. Often the presupposition used in a loaded question overwhelms a person and they don't know how to respond at times. I consider most loaded questions malicious or at the very least intentional. Someone can unintentionally presuppose something, but that's less usual, because they cumulatively imply that at those times I looked like a druggie or a hospital patient, horribly insulting and incorrect implications. I was reluctant to share those two personal examples and consider it acceptable that I did. They illustrate how loaded questions can be at times venomous and are often overwhelming. So be wary of loaded questions. If you know a presupposition is false, then just say that the presupposition is false and that you can't answer the question because of a false presupposition, or just walk away if the person is trying to be fallacious or manipulative. Conclusion. Complex question. A question where one or more things is presumed to be true and more or may not be true. Loaded question. A question where one or more controversial, offensive, or insulting aspects of the question remains. Things is presumed to be true or may not be true. False bifurcation, a restrictive question that provides two alternatives that really may have a situation where many more options exist. A red herring, ignoratio elenchi, and fallacies of relevance. A red herring is a fallacy of relevance. A red herring simply something that distracts attention from the real issues. In mystery science fiction, or mystery fiction, a red herring is an incident that makes the reader think the mystery occurred in way B, when it really occurred in way A. A red herring is just something that distracts someone or derails someone from the truth. A red herring is committed when the arguer diverts attention of the reader or listener by changing the subject to a completely different, but sometimes subtly related, one. Ignoratio elenchi, ignorance of the proof, or missing the point. Ignoratio elenchi is another fallacy of relevance. In it, premise A entails or concludes conclusion A, and then conclusion B is made. An example is people usually live to around 70 years old. Therefore, people should live to 140 years old. The average longevity of a person isn't related to a different longevity of age. Overall, this is where we will end our discussion of logical fallacies because, as you can see, many of them are incredibly similar. Indeed, some logical fallacies, like denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, and post hoc ergo propter hoc, are pretty crisply defined. But many of them are so similar, it comes across as just pseudo-sludge. Red herrings, non sequiturs, ignoratio elenchi, and begging the question are all very similar fallacies. They all make a leap to a conclusion without evidence or valid premises. Anyways, thanks for reading this book on logical fallacies. Best to stick with logic. Conclusion. I hope you enjoyed this succinct little cognitive immunization book. It contained most of the major logical fallacies. There are other logical fallacies, but they are all really slight variations of the ones presented in my detection kit. If you did read this book thoroughly and occasionally do refer back to it as reference, you may very likely have mental alerts go off when you see or hear someone or yourself using a logical fallacy. You can match the logical fallacies in advertisements, conversations, newspaper articles, books, arguments, or common chit-chat. You may hear and observe people infected with many of the fallacies presented in this book while watching the telly or in conversation with people whom you know or don't know. Strangers, friends, foreigners, bosses, employees, colleagues, teachers, students, scientists, theologists, philosophers, lawyers, car salesmen, botanists, chemists, everyone may unconsciously commit a logical fallacy at some time. This book has protected you against them. You may start to observe a few logical fallacies you've held as well. How you respond to react to logical fallacies is your choice. What you choose to do or say, or not do or say, is entirely up to you. But I hope, at the very least, you will safely chuckle to yourself at a failed attempt of someone else's illogical thinking. You could outright inform them of their infection. Hey, that's actually argumentum ad hominem and is a logical fallacy, for example. Or you could subtly reveal to them their diseased thinking by saying something like, that's interesting, but if someone says that is true, then it's true. It doesn't matter if they smell odd or look weird or the level of trust you have in them. But the most important thing is that your thinking is sharper, clearer, and more adroit and safer than someone unaware of these logical fallacies. You just got your cognitive antivirus booster shots. Most likely, you are now more likely can accurately comprehend causality and can repeat specific causes that resulted in auspicious and successful effects. I trust this little, short, but very potent book has made your mind practically immune to logical thinking. Your brain is unquestionably safer as the result of reading this book. But you now have a built-in logical fallacy detection kit. I would normally suggest that you use that kit wisely, but considering that the outcome of such a kit is indeed clear and wise thinking, such encouragement would be redundant because you're already wise and clear in your thinking. So enjoy using your logical fallacy detection kit. May it keep your mind safe and sound, and may it immunize you from the infections of illogical thought, pseudologic, assumptions, generalizations, and all other forms of blurred thinking. Logic is an interesting thing. To many it may be confusing and unnecessary, but ultimately logic is safety. Logic is understanding, and it's 100% comprehension of a truth. Logic verifies truths. Like a scalpel or any precise surgical instrument, your mind is now a blade that can heal or harm. Keep it sharp by referring back to this detection kit, and keep your eyes and ears open for the symptoms of illogical infections. Most importantly, by far, enjoy the fun and clarity that results from eliminating logical fallacies, and enjoy a lucid, streamlined mind. The end. About the author, John Thomas Kooz updates his annual bio every year at johnkooz.com. He holds a bachelor's degree from Colorado College, which wasn't all that useful other than saying that he earned the degree, which proved to have no doubt no usefulness, but it was a good college experience. A certified professional coach certification from the International Coach Academy, has completed 2 marathons, has traveled the world, has written over 3.3 million words, occasionally can't distinguish his strength from areas that hold less expertise, is a downright genius in some areas of focus, and in other areas quite a moron, likes podcasting and doing YouTubes, detests slavery, wrongful imprisonment, and cars, doesn't sleep on a bed, has lived in the jungle and the bush, loves beautiful, peaceful-looking women, obsessively, compulsively collects flora at times, likes enjoying oranges, fish, and salad, loves classical music, and is interested in the United Kingdom, Australia, and Asia. Again, the full details of his evolutionary version are at the link above. Resources for more information, awesomeness, audios, and vids. Again, this last page left intentionally blank. I don't know why so many authors, editors, and or publishers leave intentional blank pages, and I do note that if a page says page left intentionally blank, it's not really blank, is it? All pages of my book have some content on them, even the intentionally blank ones.